There, I wanted to go over Chapter 5 notes with you before we get started on all the lab activities that we have planned for this unit. So initially what I would like you to do is think back to Chapter 1 when we talk about the different types of species and what species actually are. So in terms of the definition, we define species to be a group of organisms that are different from any other groups of organisms in terms of size or behavior, shape, maybe their genetic makeup, and also that they cannot interbreed with other species. So they can only reproduce with different organisms within the same species. So we are going to look at the fact that it is very difficult to estimate exactly how many types of species we have on Earth because they are constantly evolving and they have changed over time. Now, the thing to remember and keep in mind is that individuals don't evolve, but populations evolve over a longer period of time. So you as an individual do not evolve to be able to withstand certain environmental aspects. The population of individuals may evolve over time. So scientists have named approximately 2 million different species, and that simply indicates that there is estimated to be about a 5-fold number of species worldwide that just have not been identified yet. Okay. So we can quantify biodiversity in a couple of different ways. We can look at species richness, and species richness will give you the number of different species within a given area. So you can look at a forested area and see how many different species of trees are there. If you have a field of corn that's practically a monoculture type of ecosystem, the number of species present within that ecosystem is going to be very low. If you travel to a tropical rainforest, when we have a great variety of different species, that species richness value is going to be much higher. When we talk about species evenness, that will tell you how evenly distributed those different species are. So how many of trees of species A do you have in an area as compared to the species B within that same area. So we can look at this example here of two communities of trees and notice that we can measure the diversity within that ecosystem by comparing the different values of different trees present within this ecosystem. Let me zoom out a little bit, see if that will help you see it better. So we have 4 species of trees, right? We have our population A here. Let me see if I can mark it for you. We have population B, we have population C and D of different trees. Within the same area of the ecosystem, we have the 2 communities, and the values and the distribution of different species is going to be different, as indicated underneath the each image in there. Okay. We can look at the branching pattern of relationships as organisms or populations have evolved over time and see how they are linked to each other. So the more similar the traits of 2 species, the more closely related they are to each other. And this is what we see here. Okay, we have a common ancestor to all of these organisms on the top of the image, right? And as time progressed, as the time increased, you know, from past time all the way to today, those relationships have kind of branched out. And as time progressed, the populations evolved, and then we end up with a variety of different organisms. So looking at evolution and how does that relate to creating new biodiversity, what I want you to understand is that when we talk about evolution, it is the change in genetic makeup or genetic composition in populations over time. Again, very important, individuals do not evolve, populations evolve over time. And we are going to see that in the couple of labs that we are going to be working on over the course of this unit. We can split evolution into two different types. We can look at it in terms of microevolution, where the evolution happens below the species level. Macroevolution will happen where we create new species within that ecosystem. When we talk about genes, it's the actual location where the chromosomes lie within each cell of an organism. The complete set of genes within an individual is known as genotype, and then a set of traits that is expressed or something that you can distinguish between different species will be known as phenotype. Okay? The genotypes will help determine the traits of individuals. Sometimes what happens as the cells divide or split, there's a change, a random change, which we refer to as mutation. When the mutations actually happen, those mutations can be passed on to future generations. For example, some people have genetic disorders that can be passed from parents to their children, and then it can be passed on to their grandchildren because it is a genetic mutation, and it can be passed from one level of population to the other. So I guess from parents to their children, grandchildren, etc. Sometimes mutations are good. It will increase the chances of survival or reproduction for different organisms, and that's something that we are going to be focusing on in this class, is how those genetic mutations will improve your chances of surviving to age where you can actually reproduce and produce offspring, hopefully that has that same mutation that will put them at an advantage as compared to the other members of the same species. When we talk about recombination, it's a process in which one chromosome breaks off and attaches to another chromosome, but that process does not create new genes. Rather, it produces new traits. Okay? For example, as listed in here, you have the human immune system that will battle a lot of different viruses and bacteria. Recombination will allow us to actually come together and produce that immune response. Evolution by artificial selection, we are going to look at it in terms of humans determining which individuals to breed, which traits to preserve within a species. So for example, when you think about dogs, all breeds have a common ancestor. However, your Chihuahua is going to be very different than your Great Dane, right? They're still both considered to be dogs, but they are very different. And they are different because of artificial selection. So people have bred certain dogs that would have different traits to preserve those traits, to pass them on to the future generations of dogs. Also, a lot of agricultural crops are a result of careful breeding, right? You want to make sure that you breed plants that produce the best fruit or the best tasting fruit, or maybe ones that are most resilient or resistant to pests. So here's an example of our dogs, right? We have a common ancestor, which is the wolf, and then we have, through artificial selection, created a variety of different breeds. We can also have evolution that will occur through natural selection. And the process was first described by Darwin, and it's pretty much describing the process in which the environment will determine or help you determine which individuals are going to survive long enough to reproduce. Because we know that not all offspring are going to survive. Okay, not all offsprings are going to survive long enough to produce offspring. The differences in traits can be passed from parents to offspring, but not necessarily. And then the mutations that are beneficial to the parents hopefully are being passed to their offspring so they can get those benefits as well. So looking at this image here, and you can see it in more detail in your textbook, but we're looking at the fact that different species will produce an excess number of offspring, because it's known that not every offspring is going to live long enough to reproduce. So that's something to always keep in mind. We are going to come back to different types of species, either R selected or K selected, and that will determine kind of how much parental involvement is kind of natural to that species, because certain species will take care of their offspring for much longer, let's say humans, than others, where they have a lot of offspring, knowing that they will require less parental involvement and they are going to be, sent on their own much earlier in their lives, and they are assumed to not survive for the most part till the reproductive years. So when we talk about fitness in natural selection, we are not talking about how much weights you can lift, but it's talking about the individual's ability to survive and survive long enough to reproduce. Okay? An adaptation is a trait that might improve your chances of surviving long enough to reproduce. There are also a number of different random processes that will lead to evolution and change in populations. Mutations, like I've mentioned already, gene flow, genetic drift, bottleneck effects, and founder effects. And we are going to go over those here shortly. When we talk about mutation, we're looking at two populations or two different traits within a population of mice. The first population is 10% black, 90% white, and the population of black mice is there because there was a random mutation within that mouse. As time progresses and those mice will reproduce with each other, your population may change over time, right? You may end up with now 3 out of 10 mice being black and the remaining population be white. So that would be something that happens because of mutation. A gene flow is a process in which individuals move from one population to another. So you may have new set of genes arriving with a new member of that population. Okay, and we can have an example here of the Florida panther. As they declined in population, there was fewer genetic variations within that population, and started showing signs of inbreeding. And we know that within inbreeding there is some health issues. They're not as advantaged to live longer to reproduce if there are major health defects. So what happened was there were panthers introduced from Texas to bring in the different pool of genes into that population. And that led to increase of population, and then you had growth of population from 30 to 160 individuals. Genetic drift is going to happen over time because of random mating. Okay, so it is a random process, and it can have a particularly important role in altering the composition of genetic makeup within small populations. So in your first population, in a small population here on the top of this slide, you have a population that's 40% black, 60% white, and certain genes might be lost over time because of random mating, okay? And eventually that gene that gives mice black fur might be lost over time in that population. Within a large population, that does not happen as much because you have more individuals to mate with. So you don't have only 2 individuals that have black fur. You may have, even though the same percentage of black to white mice, you have larger number of individuals that are there to mate with. So your over time, your genetic composition is going to remain approximately the same. Okay. A bottleneck effect happens when you have a great reduction in genetic diversity in a short period of time. So if you could imagine a bottle that has a wider bottom and more narrow top, you're kind of squeezing that entire population into that smaller size. So oftentimes bottleneck effect will lead to low diversity because you're eliminating a great number in terms of genetic diversity within a population. Okay. So you may have a population that perhaps was exposed to some sort of parasite and it killed off a lot of members of that population. So your number of individuals to kind of start that population back up is much lower, so you have much less in terms of genetic variability within that new population, because you are starting off with a much smaller number of individuals to reproduce. Founder effect is a change in genetic composition of population because of colonizing different areas. And we are going to talk about island biogeography. It's going to be one of the first labs you do where we look at populations and how they change as they're being shifted and colonizing different areas of land. So right now we're going to look at speciation and the pace of evolution. Okay, you may have 2 different processes that will allow for change in speciation. First one is going to be the allopatric speciation, where it happens because of geographic isolation. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples here in just a minute. The sympatric speciation will happen where the evolution happens of one species into 2 without an actual geographic isolation. Okay, so when I talk about geographic isolation, it's the physical separation of group of individuals within of the same species, and now you're forcing it by geographic changes to form 2 different areas of land that the species might occupy. The reproductive isolation is going to be a result of 2 species evolving separately to the point where they can no longer interbreed with each other and produce viable offspring. So in the allopatric speciation, where you have that geographic change, you have this land that's housing 2 different species of mice, one black and one white. And then all of a sudden there might be a flood, or a new riverbed forming, and now you split these two landforms into, and therefore splitting those two populations into two. Over time, you may have change in genetic makeup of those two populations. So you might end up with, two populations that are evolving independently of each other. Eventually, those two populations are going to become distinct in their genetic makeup. And then over time, let's say that river dries up, and those two populations can no longer interbreed with each other. Flowering plants often go through what's known as the sympatric speciation, and that's where we have the genetic changes where you can no longer reproduce with other members of what was prior to this time was a common species. So there's the pace of evolution will depend on several factors. Some people will, or some species are going to evolve rather quickly, especially if they're being done by artificial selection. So again, think about breeding dogs for specific traits. We are going to come back to GMOs. Those are the genetically modified organisms that the genes are manipulated in a way that they want to preserve special traits within that organism. We can look at the different niches and how those will affect populations. Each species is going to have a range of tolerance, meaning that there's only certain amount of or certain temperatures that they can be able to survive in, okay, that they can tolerate certain conditions. We can look at the distribution of species, and then again that will be closely related to the different biomes, and I know we talked about biomes already this semester, so this should sound familiar. Your tropical fish are not going to be able to survive in a Arctic ocean. It's outside of their range of tolerance for their body to be able to survive in those cold temperatures. Okay, so we all have our optimal environment in which we survive, and you can look at the performance over a temperature. So you may have some species that in low temperatures are going to be able to survive, but it may not be warm enough for them to grow and reproduce, right? So as the temperature will increase, right, the performance is going to spike up again because you have, those optimal temperatures that those organisms will like. They will survive, grow, reproduce, and strive. And then as the temperature increases, again, it gets too hot for them, so they are not going to reproduce as readily. And then, if it gets too hot, they may not even be able to survive. Niche generalist and specialist. A generalist is going to be one that will be able to live in a wide range of abiotic and biotic conditions, meaning that they are pretty happy anywhere they go. A specialist, on the other hand, is going to be one that needs a specific habitat to survive in. Okay. Environmental change can actually change the distributions of species because, the temperatures, water availability is going to change which species can live in which environments. So again, if you think about biotic and abiotic factors are dependent on abiotic factors, meaning that plants and animals are only going to survive in a specific environment, like specific range of temperature, specific range of precipitation, etc. And then those environmental changes, those rapid environmental changes, can lead to extinctions. And by extinctions, I mean by removal of large amount of species within an ecosystem. And we have had 5 global mass extinctions. We are what's known in the 6th extinction right now, where we see a rapid decline in the number of species on a global scale. And that will conclude our chapter 5. I hope you're excited to do all the labs we have planned for this unit, and I will see you in class.